Grace Mitchell wiped the same patch of countertop for the third time that morning, her fingers raw from the endless scrubbing. The breakfast crowd had come and gone, or what passed for a crowd these days, just a pair of truckers and three farmers nursing black coffee and biscuits in near silence. Outside, the quiet streets of Willow Bend stood frozen in time. The old textile mill had closed 3 years ago, and with it went most of the town's livelihood. Now boarded-up storefronts lined the main drag like tombstones, and Grace's diner, once a symbol of small-town pride, was on life support. Still, she opened each morning before dawn, not just out of habit, but out of hope. Hope that maybe today would be different. Hope that the final notice stamped on the electric bill in her purse wouldn't be the last word for Mitchell's diner. She leaned on the counter and glanced toward the kitchen, where the buzz of an aging refrigerator provided the only noise in the lull between orders. Her father's old radio, now permanently tuned to AM classics, crackled low in the background. Grace's father, Walter Mitchell, had once run this place with booming laughter and a spatula that never cooled, but a stroke had taken his voice and most of his movement. Now Grace balanced running the business with managing his medication schedule, his therapy appointments, and the quiet heartbreak of watching a giant fade into a shadow. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a full night's sleep or a full bank account. Still, quitting was never an option. She had made a silent vow by his hospital bedside, keep the diner alive until he could walk through the doors again. That vow was interrupted by the sharp jingle of the front doorbell. Grace straightened reflexively, wiping her hands on her apron as a figure stepped into the light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face lined by time and travel. Dust clung to his leather jacket like a second skin, and his steel-grey beard gave him the look of a man who'd seen both war and peace. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't his presence, it was the patch stitched across his back. A skeletal reaper wielding a scythe, the symbol of the Grim Reaper's motorcycle club. Even the radio seemed to falter for a beat. Customers stiffened. One man lowered his mug with a sharp clink. A woman near the window clutched her purse. Grace could feel the air thicken with unease, but she remembered her father's mantra, the one he drilled into her from the time she could reach the countertop. Every person who walks through that door gets served with dignity. The biker moved toward the far end of the counter and sat down slowly like a man aware of the eyes tracking his every step. He didn't make a scene. He didn't ask for special treatment. He simply sat hunched slightly, as though trying to shrink himself. Grace hesitated for a breath, then filled a water glass, grabbed a menu, and walked over. "Welcome to Mitchell's," she said evenly, her voice catching slightly, but steady enough to hold. "Today's special is chicken fried steak with mashed potatoes, made fresh this morning." The man looked up, and Grace felt her breath stick in her throat. His eyes were pale blue bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion. Not the kind you sleep off, but the kind that clings to your bones. "Coffee," he said quietly. "Black. Whatever's quickest." She nodded and turned, pouring from the pot like it was any other day, but her eyes couldn't help but notice the hospital bracelet peeking out from under his cuff. She set the cup down gently and asked, "Long ride ahead of you?" The man nodded. "Not really. Headed to the hospital. Willow Bend General." His voice cracked on the last word. "My daughter's in the oncology ward. Stage 4. We're trying something new." His eyes dropped to the swirling black of his coffee hands, shaking slightly as he reached for the cup. Grace felt something shift in her chest, a mix of heartbreak and recognition. She had seen that same tremble in her father's hands, in the hands of strangers holding back grief, too big to name. She didn't ask more. She just smiled softly and said, "Toast and eggs coming up. 6 minutes tops." She turned away, catching the disapproving looks from across the diner, the ones that said she was being foolish, that she was asking for trouble. But Grace had never been the type to let fear write her story. As she called the order to the kitchen, Grace felt the tension crawl up her spine. She knew what people were thinking. That the patch on that man's jacket meant danger, meant crime, meant baggage the diner couldn't afford. But she also saw what others didn't. The tremble in his hands, the exhaustion in his posture, the quiet desperation in his voice. He wasn't just a biker. He was a father, a man trying to make it through one more day. And that Grace decided in that moment was more important than public opinion. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward, not just to serve him a plate of food, but to serve him humanity. And in doing so, she had no idea that her quiet act of kindness would set into motion a chain of events that would change her life, her diner, and her entire town forever. The calm in Mitchell's diner didn't last long. Just as Grace turned to grab the toast for Tommy's plate, the doorbell jingled again, sharper this time, cutting through the low hum of conversation like a blade. Grace didn't need to look up to know who had entered. She felt it in the stillness that swept over the room, in the sudden silence from the corner booth, in the way one customer lowered their eyes to avoid attention. Sheriff Mike Dalton and Deputy Rachel Flynn had arrived in full uniform boots, polished badges catching the morning sun as it filtered through dusty windows. Mike walked with the slow, deliberate swagger of a man who knew the weight his presence carried in a town like Willow Bend. He scanned the room like a hawk over open ground and locked eyes on Tommy the moment he spotted the Grim Reaper patch on his jacket. Tommy didn't look up. He simply sipped his coffee, hands steady despite the tension tightening around him. But Grace saw the slight change in his posture, a man bracing himself for what he knew was coming. Sheriff Dalton approached the counter, placing one arm down with a casual dominance that made it feel more like a challenge than a conversation. "Don't see your kind in here too often," he said, voice loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Deputy Flynn stood just behind him, posture, stiff eyes uncertain. Grace saw the flicker of hesitation in Rachel's gaze, perhaps a trace of discomfort, but Mike's voice drowned everything else out. "Maybe we should check his ID," he continued. "Make sure he's not one of the names we've seen in those biker bulletins." The words struck like a slap across the counter. Tommy's hand moved slowly, deliberately toward his inside pocket, clearly signaling no threat, but Mike's hand instinctively dropped toward the holster on his hip. That was when Grace moved. She stepped out from behind the counter and positioned herself between the sheriff and her customer. "He's a paying customer. Sheriff Dalton," she said, her voice sharp but calm. "Just like anyone else who walks through that door." Mike turned his eyes on her, a smirk crawling across his face. "You sure about that?" he said, gesturing toward the grim patch on Tommy's back. "That symbol doesn't exactly scream harmless." But Grace didn't flinch. "Symbols don't scare me," she replied. "Actions do. And so far, all he's done is order coffee and eggs." Sheriff Dalton's smirk faded into something colder. "You're making a mistake, Grace," he said low, almost like a warning. "This town doesn't take kindly to people who stand on the wrong side of things." But Grace stood firm, even as she felt the eyes of every customer boring into her, silently urging her to back down. Some with fear, others with judgment. Still, she remembered the words her father had repeated over and over when she was growing up. "You treat people how they treat you, not how they look. And when you have a choice between silence and justice, always choose justice." Her hands were trembling, but her voice remained clear. "He hasn't done anything wrong, Sheriff. You don't get to harass someone because of a jacket." Mike didn't argue further. Instead, he tossed a crumpled bill onto the counter and turned on his heel. "Let's go, Rachel," he barked. Deputy Flynn hesitated for half a second, glancing between Grace and Tommy with something almost like regret in her eyes before following her superior out the door. The bell rang behind them, dull and hollow. The diner was left in a silence far heavier than before. Grace turned back to Tommy, whose hand had returned to his coffee. He reached into his wallet, pulling out a $20 bill and placing it neatly beneath the mug. "Breakfast is on me," Grace said quietly. "No charge today." Tommy blinked clearly, surprised, his lips parting as if to argue, but something in her eyes stopped him. He nodded instead, stood and walked out without another word. As the door closed behind him, Grace stood at the counter for a long moment, trying to steady her breath. The whispers came next, soft but slicing. Why did she get involved? Doesn't she know who that was? This is going to ruin her business." Grace didn't answer. She didn't look up. She just wiped the already clean counter in small, slow circles. That night, as she closed the diner and locked up, she found a sign taped to the door. Cardboard, red paint. Ugly words. No biker lovers. No troublemakers. Her stomach dropped. She tore it down and crumpled it, but the message lingered like smoke in her lungs. Still, as she sat beside her father's hospital bed that night, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest under a hospital blanket, she held his hand and whispered, "I stood up today, Dad, just like you taught me." She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: she had done the right thing, and she wouldn't back down now. The next morning arrived with a heavy silence. Grace stood behind the counter at Mitchell's diner, staring at the untouched coffee pot and stacks of clean plates. The usual crowd, Martha Whitman, with her crossword, the chess-playing retirees, and the two truckers who always ordered the same thing, were nowhere to be seen. The absence wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The town had turned its back on her overnight. The air felt thick with judgment, as if every empty chair whispered you should have stayed silent. Still, Grace opened the diner like she always did. She brewed fresh coffee, wiped down already gleaming tables, and kept the kitchen warm, not because she expected customers, but because dignity doesn't take a day off. Just past noon, the doorbell jingled. Grace looked up, expecting maybe a lost traveler or a delivery person, but instead a man and woman stepped inside their presence, quiet but unmistakably purposeful. The man was lean and sun-touched, in his early 50s, his jacket marked with a silver skull pin, the understated but familiar symbol of the Grim Reapers. The woman beside him wore her hair in a long grey braid and had eyes that held both strength and sorrow. "Grace Mitchell?" the man asked. She nodded cautiously. "I'm David Brooks. This is my wife, Karen, Tommy's brother." Grace's shoulders relaxed slightly as she stepped out from behind the counter. The handshake they offered was firm, genuine, like a thank you spoken through skin. "He told us what you did," Karen said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "He wanted to come himself, but his daughter's still in the hospital. The treatment's experimental, last chance stuff." Grace felt a tightening in her chest, the kind that comes when compassion meets helplessness. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't do anything special." But David shook his head. "You did," he said simply. "You didn't see the patch, you saw the man." Grace didn't have a reply to that, only a small, tired smile and an offer of coffee. They sat and sipped in companionable quiet, something in their posture hinting that their visit wasn't over yet. Karen looked at the clock and smiled. "Give it a minute." At first, it was just a sound low and distant, like thunder rolling in from the horizon. Then it grew louder, steady, rhythmic. Grace stepped to the window and felt her breath catch. The street outside shimmered with chrome and leather. Motorcycles, dozens of them, then hundreds. They came from both directions, lining the streets in front of the diner and stretching beyond what her eyes could follow. Every single rider wore some version of the Grim Reaper's patch, different chapters, different states, but all riding with the same silent purpose. The engines roared, then slowly fell quiet as one by one the bikers parked, dismounted, and began making their way toward Mitchell's diner. Grace stood frozen as the parking lot disappeared beneath boots and denim leather and steel. She turned to David and Karen, overwhelmed. "What is this?" she asked in a whisper. Karen's eyes glimmered with unshed tears. Tommy told his chapter. They told others. Word spreads fast in our world. When someone treats one of us like a human being, we remember. The bell above the door rang again and again until every booth was full, every counter stool occupied, and the walls of the diner hummed with quiet reverence. The bikers were calm, respectful. They ordered food, nodded in thanks, and treated Grace like royalty. And though the place had never been louder, it felt like the safest it had ever been. Delivery trucks rolled up behind the building shortly after. David explained that the bikers had contacted Grace's suppliers the night before and prepaid for a full restock eggs, bread meat, coffee, and pie filling. Several bikers formed an impromptu line to unload the crates, laughing and joking like old friends on a mission. Inside, Grace worked alongside the community she didn't know she had. A few teens from the local church youth group showed up to help. Even a neighbor who hadn't spoken to Grace in 2 years came in, rolled up her sleeves, and began brewing coffee. As the aroma of fresh food filled the air, something even more powerful took root: curiosity. Locals began to drift in. First a few hesitant steps, then conversations, then laughter. By mid-afternoon, Mitchell's diner was overflowing, not just with customers, but with connection, with understanding, with hope. And at the heart of it all stood Grace Mitchell, apron stained with syrup and coffee smile, worn but true, watching a miracle unfold one plate at a time. That evening, long after the last plate had been served, and the coffee pots refilled more times than Grace could count, the bell over Mitchell's diner jingled one final time. Standing in the doorway was a man whose presence quieted the crowd instantly. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with a thick white beard and a leather vest adorned with bold patches. The largest one read President Grim Reaper's MC Riverside Chapter. His boots echoed across the tile floor as he approached the counter, but his smile was gentle sunlight softened by gravel. He extended a hand to Grace with the confidence of a man used to leading armies. "You must be Grace Mitchell," he said. "I'm Marcus Turner." Grace shook his hand, trying to match his steady grip, her fingers still aching from the day's whirlwind. "Welcome to Mitchell's," she said, voice steady, despite the lump in her throat. Marcus turned toward the room, raising a hand to signal silence. The conversations died down as easily as a dimmed light. All eyes followed him as he spoke. "We ride with honor. We ride with loyalty. And we ride with memory. Grace here. She showed one of our own something too rare in this world. She didn't judge him for the patch on his back. She saw the man, the father, the human." A wave of quiet agreement rippled through the packed diner. So from this day forward, Marcus continued Mitchell's diner rides under the protection of the Grim Reapers. The room erupted in applause. Some pounded fists on tables, others whistled or clapped, tears in their eyes. Grace stood in stunned silence, the weight of that declaration settling over her like a warm blanket. She wasn't alone anymore, and this wasn't just a promise, it was a shield. Later that night, as the crowd slowly dispersed into the golden wash of street lamps and motorcycle headlights, David and Karen returned with a wrapped brown package. Karen held it delicately, while David placed it in Grace's hands. "From all of us," he said. Grace opened the package, slowly revealing a custom black leather vest. It was soft and sturdy, stitched with bold white letters, Mitchell's Diner, across the back. Above it, the words, "Friend of the Reapers." And just below, a smaller patch read simply, "Protected." Grace didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as her fingers traced the stitching like it was sacred. "You earned that," Karen whispered. Not with noise, not with force, but with grace, no pun intended. Everyone chuckled softly, and Grace held the vest to her chest, letting herself feel fully and freely the meaning it carried. Word spread fast through Willow Bend. By the following weekend, the same people who had whispered about her judgment were now curious, maybe even a little remorseful. Martha Whitman returned to her usual window booth, setting down her crossword puzzle and asking politely if the biscuit recipe had changed. Joe the chess player brought his grandkids to look at the parked motorcycles lined up like chrome sentinels along Main Street, and even Deputy Rachel Flynn, who had stood silent the day the sheriff confronted Tommy, came in wearing plain clothes. She sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and gave Grace a nod that said more than an apology ever could. There was no ceremony, no big reconciliation speech, just quiet reappearances and small gestures that spoke of healing. The town hadn't changed overnight, but it had begun to soften, and so had the diner. It became more than a place to eat. It became a refuge, a meeting ground, where nobody asked what patch you wore or what mistakes you'd made. A place where laughter echoed off the walls and stories were shared between slices of pie and second cups of coffee. Grace brought in a few extra hands to help young folks looking for work, a retired teacher who missed being useful, even a local vet who baked a mean apple crumble. Everyone belonged. No one was turned away. Grace hung the vest next to her father's stained apron and faded photo on the diner wall, the two symbols side by side, tradition and transformation, past and future. She often found herself glancing at them when things got busy, drawing strength from the quiet legacy they represented. It was exactly what her father had always hoped for. Not just a successful business, but a living, breathing embodiment of decency. He used to say, it's not just food that fills a belly, it's feeling seen, feeling safe, feeling human. Now Mitchell's Diner stood as proof of that vision, where leather jackets and police uniforms could sit side by side, where quilt-loving grandmothers shared booths with tattooed bikers, where people came not just to eat, but to heal. Grace, often working the pass-through window, would take a pause sometimes, just a brief second to absorb the joy around her. To breathe in the scent of fried eggs, fresh coffee and forgiveness. In a town that once turned away, Grace had planted roots of compassion so deep they had started to crack the concrete, and from those cracks something beautiful had bloomed. A week had passed since the day the bikers filled the streets of Willow Bend, yet the town still buzzed with the quiet aftershock of something remarkable. Mitchell's Diner, once a modest, overlooked corner of Main Street, had transformed into something sacred. Each morning Grace unlocked the doors with a renewed sense of purpose, her movements slower, more deliberate, not from exhaustion, but from reverence. Then one afternoon, just as the golden light began slanting through the front windows, the bell above the door rang with a familiar chime. She looked up and froze. Standing there, dusty and tired, but smiling, was Tommy Brooks. His eyes were red-rimmed, not with sorrow this time, but with something softer, almost fragile. Hope. Grace stepped out from behind the counter as Tommy approached. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. Finally, Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It was a girl, early teens, pale but smiling, sitting upright in a hospital bed, clutching a teddy bear and wearing a knitted cap. "Her name's Emily," he said, voice gravelly but warm. "Doctors say the new treatment's showing signs. She's stable, better than she's been in months." Grace blinked back tears. Tommy hesitated, then added, "She wants to meet you. Said you sound like the kind of woman she wants to be when she grows up." The weight of those words hit Grace like a wave. She pressed the photo to her heart and nodded, speechless. In that moment, everything she had endured, the loneliness, the whispers, the fear, felt not only worth it, but transformed into something bigger than herself. As the days passed, the walls between the townspeople and the bikers thinned, then disappeared entirely. On Saturday mornings, you could find Martha Whitman sitting with Karen Brooks trading pie recipes while their husbands played dominoes in the back. Deputy Rachel Flynn, now a regular in plain clothes, even helped organize a charity ride for the local hospital. Locals and riders alike pitched in, painting the diner's faded trim planting flowers out front, fixing the broken neon sign that hadn't lit up in 5 years. Grace often caught herself watching it all from the kitchen window, smiling at the impossible made real. There was no rule book for what was happening, just a shared understanding that kindness had opened a door and none of them wanted to close it. On one particularly quiet evening, after the last customer had paid and the chairs were flipped onto tables, Grace stood alone near the wall where 2 garments now hung in proud, solemn silence. One was her father's old apron, faded, stained soft from years of wear. The other, her custom leather vest, bold and black, its stitching crisp and defiant. Friend of the reapers. Protected. The juxtaposition made her chest ache in the most unexpected way. One was the legacy of everything she had inherited. The other, everything she had earned. Beneath them stood Grace Mitchell, Not the same woman who had once worried about how many eggs she could afford to crack in the morning, but the woman who had cracked open an entire town with a single act of compassion. She traced the edge of her father's apron with one hand, remembering how he used to whistle while flipping pancakes, how he'd greet every customer like a neighbor, whether they wore a badge or a leather jacket. "You treat people by how they act, Gracie," he'd always say, "not how they look or what others whisper." Now those words weren't just a memory, they were etched into the soul of Mitchell's diner. Grace had lived them, and the town had listened. It hadn't happened with protests or speeches, but with coffee, with patience, with a seat offered to someone no one else would sit beside. It was the slow work of healing, and in that healing a new kind of legacy had bloomed. As the lights dimmed and the night settled in, Grace stepped outside, apron still tied at the waist, arms folded loosely as she gazed up at the stars above Willow Bend. She thought of Emily, still fighting, still smiling. She thought of Tommy, who had walked through her door a stranger and left behind a community. And she thought of her father, who would never fully see what his daughter had built from his teachings, but whose spirit was in every brick, every smile, every plate of food. Grace knew the world was still flawed, still hard, still full of people who judged first and asked later. But she also knew deep in her bones that it only took one brave act to make a crack in that wall. One cup of coffee. One voice that didn't look away. And maybe that was enough to change a diner, a town, and the world. If this story moved you the way it moved us, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Deep Inside HQ for more powerful stories that shine a light on courage, compassion, and the quiet heroes who change the world one act at a time. Leave us a comment with your thoughts, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment that might just restore your faith in humanity. This isn't just storytelling. It's a journey through the heart of what really matters.